Okay, so now we're going to jump into working on the actual etude. For this segment, we're going to work on the theme, variation 1, and variation 2. So we're going to stop right here. And I think that all three of these are very similar, so I think that it's a good idea to kind of work on the three of them together. The very first thing that I want to talk about, and I've taught at band camp for many years, and I've judged the middle school audition for many years. And so I can share with you some of the common mistakes that I hear from a lot of students. The very first one is that people tend to go way too fast on the theme, and then everything else is not matching up as far as rhythm. So this theme is supposed to be slower, and it's supposed to be lyrical, meaning more song-like and beautiful. And so do not go too fast on this, because if you notice, if you go all the way to the bottom at variation 5, we have 16th notes. And so if your quarter note tempo is too fast at the top, and then you get to these 16th notes, you're going to have to play them really fast in order to match the tempo, or the tempos just aren't going to line up at all. And so that's the number one mistake I often hear, is the inconsistent tempo, because people start the theme too fast. Okay, so it says moderato, quarter note equals 80. It does not need to go any faster than that. Okay, all right, so first of all, let's talk about where to breathe. Okay, I would take a breath right here. You oftentimes don't want to take a breath on a bar line, because it will interrupt the phrase unless it's the end of the phrase. But I feel like this is a good place to take a breath, and you're going to want to take a big breath. Now, the danger is that you could possibly chop the note too early before you take the breath. So be sure that you play that G for the full 2 beats and then take a good breath. Okay, so I'm going to turn on my metronome, and I'll go ahead and play the theme. And again, I'm remembering my vibrato exercise, and I'm going to try to make my best, fullest sound. Okay, so a couple of the more important things, I put a lot of vibrato on the half notes especially. And then you notice here at the end, you have these dynamics. You want to be sure you're doing dynamics. That also is another thing that a lot of students don't do. And so if you are a student who does them, that's going to put you ahead of anybody who doesn't do those dynamics. So be sure that when you do it, you exaggerate it. You make a big deal out of it. Okay? So the next little section we're going to look at is going to be variation 1. Variation 1, as far as the rhythm, is very straightforward, but oftentimes people have trouble with this rhythm right here. I kind of drew over it, sorry. Okay, so this rhythm right here, it's going to be the dotted quarter note. There we go. This is hard to draw with. So the dotted quarter note, 8th note rhythm. Okay, so I've heard a lot of students play those as 2 straight quarter notes, and I'm always like, they totally do not look like 2 quarter notes at all, but that's the most common mistake, is I hear students do that. So the dot after that quarter note is referring to the length of the note. It means that you're taking that note and you're going to make it half as long, or excuse me, you're adding half the value to whatever it follows. So you have to remember, what is a quarter note when you divide it in half? It's an 8th note. And so you're adding the value of an 8th note to a quarter note. So what that looks like is there are 3 8th notes inside the dotted quarter note. If you remember what we were talking about earlier with rhythm, that means that an 8th note is going to be worth a half of a beat. And so essentially this is worth a beat and a half. What your foot is going to do in a beat and a half is go down, up for a full beat, and then down again. And then this last 8th note will be on an upbeat. So I always tell my students that this is called a down, up, down taste, because that's exactly what your foot is doing. And then we refer to that upbeat as te. You might be a person that also refers to your upbeat as and, but either way, however, whatever counting system you use, that last note is on the upbeat. So you have to think down, up, down, te. So how I have my students practice this is I actually have them articulate the 8th notes inside it. So again, I'm going to turn on my metronome at 80. Okay, and this is how I'm going to practice it. So I'm starting beat 3 of measure 8. Okay, so once you get really good at that, that's the exact length of that of that dotted quarter, is it has 3 eighth notes inside it. So as soon as I'm really good at that, then I can just play it as written, but I'm going to continue to think that subdivision, how the note is divided in my head. And my foot, unfortunately you can't see my foot, but my foot is going down, up, down, te, and that A flat is going to come on the upbeat every single time. Okay? And you notice right here, this looks like a little apostrophe. That's actually your breath mark. So that is a place where you're allowed to breathe in a bar line because it's the end of a phrase. And so the composer gives you little hints like that. Sometimes you are allowed to breathe at the bar line, and it's usually where the composer marks it. Okay? So same thing here. You want to be sure it's still a little bit of a slower variation, and so you want to do it with your best sound and with really nice vibrato. You want all the notes to be smooth and connected. You don't want any space between the notes, and we call that legato. So everything is going to be very smooth and connected. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and play variation variation 1 for you. Feel free to play along. Let me point out one more thing to you. It's this measure right here. Okay, so you have a little bit of a tricky articulation, meaning where you're going to tongue and where you're going to slur. So if you notice, ta, ti, ta, and again, I like to put a T where I'm going to tongue. That way I be sure that I do it. And then you have to tongue this note as well. So those are really terrible T's, but this is hard to draw with. So a lot of students mess this up. So be sure that you're doing the articulation correctly. And you don't always have to just play the entire measure through. If you're having trouble remembering to tongue this note, then stop on that note and just be sure that you're tonguing it. So here's a good way to practice. So what I'm practicing is going ta, ti, ta, ta, tonguing both of those notes. And as soon as I become really good at that, at least like 5 times in a row, no mistakes, then you can try to play the entire measure. And then again, another note that students often miss is whenever you have a slur like this and you have to tongue the downbeat. A lot of students will try to slur this note right here, but you have to be sure that you tongue this downbeat as well. So again, I like to mark those with a T, and that way I remember to tongue them. Okay, so now we're going on to variation 2. Variation 2 is also very similar to variation 1, and as you can see, even the rhythm is very similar, but you're adding a few more eighth notes. Okay, so the first 2 measures are very straightforward. It does have this little pattern. If you notice, the first 4 notes and the second 4 notes are the same pattern, but it's just moving up by 1 note. So that's something that's good to notice. And then you're still going to take that breath. You see it looks like a little apostrophe. You're going to take that breath after measure 14, and then you're going to continue on. Now look at this measure right here. Here's another example of a place where you might have to practice the articulation because it can be a little tricky. You're going to slur 3 notes and then tongue 2, slur 3, tongue 2. So you have to be sure you not only tongue this note, but you tongue this note as well. So the little pattern is going to be ta, ta, ta. Now the way I would practice this would be 2 beats at a time. So I like to have my students practice 1 te, 2 te, 3, rest, 3 te, 4 te, 1, rest, 1 te, 2 te, 3. I have my students do that all the time. So practicing 2 beats at a time, you're still going on to the next beat, but then you stop for a moment. And when you stop in the practice and you're doing it with a metronome, it just gives you another moment to sort of think. And so I'll show you how I want you to practice this. So again, notice I took one beat of rest every time that I stopped, and I went 1 te, 2 te, 3, and the note I stopped on is the note I start on. 3 te, 4 te, 1, 1 te, 2 te, 3. So if you're having trouble putting all of that together, because it is a little bit of finger technique and articulation, I would strongly suggest to practice it that way. Just break it down until you get really good at it, and then put it all together. So this is what it sounds like all together. Okay, and so I would suggest to practice that a few times and get to where you can not only just do it once correctly, get to where you can do it several times in a row correctly, because that's how you know, okay, I really got it. Because sometimes students wait until they can play it correctly once, and they say, okay, I got it, I'm moving on. But get to where you can play it several times in a row without making a mistake, and then you know you really have it down. Okay, and then one more thing I want to point out here in this measure, notice that the articulation is different again. You have slur 2, tongue 2, so ta, 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 ta. So all this articulation stuff is meant to be kind of tricky. It's supposed to trick you. And so the composer is wanting you to work on that articulation and to make sure that you're doing it correctly. So notice that's not the same as this. So you have to make sure that you're making a difference with the articulation. So that's another common thing that I hear a lot in auditions is students will just completely ignore the articulation. But again, if you're one of those people who's doing it correctly, you're going to be put in front of those other students who aren't. So that's something to just be careful with, all these detail things. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and perform all of variation 2 for you. Again, feel free to play along. And I'm still at quarter note equals 80 with my metronome on the 8th note subdivision. And if you still noticed, I was still trying to play this very smoothly, very connected, and it's still a very pretty sound. Even though I have a few more notes than I did in variation 1, I would still characterize this variation as being very lyrical, not so technical. So you still want to play very smoothly and really beautiful vibrato. Okay, we're going to continue on with variation 3. I'm going to talk about variation 3 by itself just because there's a lot involved in variation 3. So it'll be these next 2 lines. So we'll stop about right here. Okay, all right, so it starts off, notice there's a key change, and we talked about this with the, if you were able to watch the helpful exercises that I gave you, this is where this changes keys. So you have to be sure, first of all, that you're playing an A natural and you're playing an E natural in this key signature. So when you get here, there's your first note that's affected by the key signature. So be sure that it's A natural, no longer A flat. Okay, let's talk about these first 2 measures. And notice there's a little bit of a tricky rhythm right here. We talked about a dotted rhythm earlier in variation 1. So again, what this dot does to the note is it adds half the value of whatever it follows. Many students think that that dot always represents the same amount of time, and that is not the case. The dot always, it depends on what it's following. It's always adding half the value to what it follows. So if you have, take a look first of all at this group of 4 16th notes, and this would be a great way to explain it. So what I've done here with this dotted rhythm is I have an 8th note, which the number of 16th notes in one 8th note would be 2. So if I were to represent this 8th note alone with no dot, it would be 2 of these 16ths. And the dot adds 1 more 16th. So what I did was I took the first 3 16th notes of a beat and I put them together, and then I have 1 16th note kind of hanging out by itself. And so that's all that is. So if you know anything about 16th notes, you know that there are going to be 2 on the downbeat and 2 on the upbeat. In other words, there's going to be 4 total in the beat. So again, if you have a metronome, this is my tonal energy app that has the 16th note subdivision, and the way you change that on the app is right up here at the top. You just hit that button and it gives you a list of different subdivisions, and you're going to click on the 16th note. Okay. Now, I would not suggest to practice this right away at quarter note equals 80. That is definitely going to be too fast for you if you're first reading. So let's start at about quarter note equals 50. So that's what my metronome is on right now. It's 50 with the 16th note subdivision. Okay, and we want to get to where we're practicing this rhythm right here. So just like what I did with you in variation 1, I'm going to have you practice tonguing that subdivision. So if you remember, there's going to be 3 16th notes in this note and 1 16th by itself. So this is going to be how you practice it. And then once you get really good about that, then you're going to practice putting that note together. So that G again represents 3 16th notes. But you're still thinking that subdivision in your head as you play. So once you get really good at that, then you can start to put all of this together. Now, here is the danger in practicing this variation. The very beginning of the variation actually has very simple rhythms, quarter notes and eighth notes mostly, but then when you get to measure 22, it has 16th notes. So just like I said at the very beginning, a lot of students try to play this part too fast, and then by the time they get to the 16th notes, they end up slowing down because they can't match that tempo. So always, always practice with your metronome. That way you understand how these slower, simpler rhythms fit in with the 16th notes. Even if it feels like this is a little bit slow, practice the entire variation the same tempo so that you understand how everything fits together. So again, I'm going 50 right now. The first part is going to feel kind of slow, but that's okay. And you might have to take a few more breaths. Okay, so let's talk about these next two measures right here. First of all, you want to be sure that you're doing the dynamics. You're starting out at forte and you need to do crescendo all the way to mezzo piano. That actually is a big dynamic change, so you want to be sure that you do that, because the really great musicians are the ones who are able to express those dynamics very clearly to the people who are listening to them play. Okay, also be aware of the articulation, where you need to slur, where you need to tongue. And then look at this right here. The composer puts in an A flat and an E flat. That kind of probably reminds you of the key signature that you were just in, which is the key of E flat. But remember that these accidentals are only good for an entire measure. And you might be questioning, okay, we're in the key of F. What is this? Is this an E flat or is it an E natural? Well, since this is good for the entire measure, it's not going to repeat the accidental because that's just a musical rule that's understood. This E is still E flat until the bar line. The bar line is, think about it as an eraser. It's just going to erase all those accidentals that were in that measure, and then you start with a clean slate whenever you get to the next measure. So our composer was nice enough to give you a courtesy accidental. He actually did not have to do that because it's, again, understood that it goes back to A natural, but it's just showing you it's going back to A natural, back to the original key. So the A flat and E flat is only good for this measure, and that's it. Okay, so then moving on to measure 22, that's when we start to dive into these little more difficult 16th note patterns. Remember, don't play this part too fast because by the time you get here, those 16th notes are going to feel really fast. I'm going to turn my metronome back on, and let's play through this together. So I'm starting at measure 22. Okay, I made a little mistake right here. Sorry about that. So remember that with these longer notes, you're wanting to still play your best, fullest sound, lots of vibrato, and I'm working to keep these 16th notes extremely even, and that's why I have my metronome set with the 16th note subdivision, because I'm trying to match what those 16th notes are doing on the metronome. So I'm trying to keep my fingers extremely even, and then as you get faster, be sure that your fingers are always hovering really close to the keys. So I'm zoomed in a little bit, and you can't see when I'm actually playing. You can't see my fingers move, but they're moving about like this. They're not moving very far at all. I oftentimes will see students pick their fingers really high off the keys, and that is at your detriment, meaning that's not going to be a good thing when you're trying to play fast, because it's inefficient and you're not going to be able to play very fast if you do that. So always work to have your fingers really close to the keys and curved and relaxed. So if you can kind of see sideways, my fingers are curved over the keys and my hands are very relaxed, not tensed up at all. Variation 4 is challenging because of the technique. Mostly you're playing up in the higher register, and it is a little bit more technical, and the articulation can be a little bit tricky as well. There's also some accidentals in there that sort of take you back to the original key of E flat, but only for a moment, because remember, those accidentals are only good for the measure. And so you just have to be very careful. There's a lot going on in these 4 measures. There's a dynamic change, there's dots on these notes, there's a slur, slur to, tongue to right here, there's a half note, and then there's a tenuto marking, which that means this note is going to be full value, where these other notes with the dots are going to be a little bit shorter. So you have to be able to play long, short, short, like that when you get here. So there's different articulations, there's technique, accidentals, and dynamics. So it's all in the details. Be sure that you get everything that's on the page. You want to be sure that you perform, and that's how you become a winner, and that's how you are able to just continue to get better as a musician. So you're playing everything on the page. So let's just first work on the first 2 measures only. And again, I'm going to keep my metronome a little bit slower. You want to start this at a slower tempo. So I'm going to go quarter note equals 50, and I'm going to have my subdivision on 16th notes. Okay, and if you notice, the first 2 beats are just an F major scale. So you probably already know this pattern. The only difference is the articulation is a little bit different. Ta, 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 ti, ta, ta, ta. I'll even have my students finger and practice saying the articulation like that. You can even practice sizzling it. You can go tss, 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 tss. That way you know exactly what to do with your air, and then go ahead and try to play it. So let's do that again, just those first 2 beats. And then if you notice in measure 27, you're going to have the same articulation. And then I want to point out this E flat right here. So the E flat is not in the key signature, but it is good for the whole measure. So this note right here is also E flat because it's good for the entire measure. And then once we get to this bar line, if I did have another E flat in this measure, or another E, it would be E natural, because that bar line cancels out those accidentals. So let's play these first 2 measures, 26 and 27. So notice I still tried to do the dynamics, and I held this half note out for 2 full beats. That's another thing that students tend to mistake, is they will, if all of a sudden there's a long note in the middle of all this technique, they will cut that note short every time. So listen again to how long that note actually is. So when you're going a slower tempo like that, that note feels like an eternity, but it really is that long. So that's why it's so important to practice with the metronome, so that the relationships and the ratios of your notes make sense and you're playing them all the correct way. We're going to continue on in the next 2 measures. So this is now measure 28 and 29. So this rhythm we talked a lot about when we did our rhythm exercise. This is the one where we have an 8th note on the downbeat and 2/16 on the upbeat. So you would think of this as down, up, and then right here it switches. I told you there's a measure in here where you're going to have to know these two rhythms and switch them. So this one is down, up, up. This one is down, down, up. So you have to be able to do those. And again, you might revisit your that exercise that I gave you. You might revisit that. And also you could just practice, just pick a note and practice those two rhythms. So I'm going to practice doing this real quickly on concert F. So I'm going to do 2 beats of this rhythm, and then I'm going to do 2 beats of this rhythm. Let's do that one more time. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to get good at switching between those two rhythms. Okay, and so once you get good at that, then you can start to put this together. So I would again suggest to practice this probably 2 beats at a time, and you can do it with a rest in between, like we did in an earlier variation. Okay, and so notice I played these short, short, long, long. That's going to be really important too, to make sure that you're getting the different articulation. I'm going to play this entire measure now for you. So it's so important that you get those two rhythms and notice that they are different. They're not going to be played the same way. Okay, and then this next measure is sort of a continuation of that same articulation, slur, tongue, tongue, slur, tongue, tongue, tongue. And then notice right here we have an E in the staff, and that is not going to be E flat because we're done with E flat. We already had that in an earlier measure and it was only good for the measure. So now we're back to good old E natural in the key of F major. So let's play this measure together. That's measure 29. And then notice on all the quarter notes, I'm using that same vibrato. Da! And it's really good to be sure you practice that vibrato exercise before you do this so that you're able to do the vibrato on all the long notes. I would say all the notes that are quarter notes and half notes, you want to be sure you're using vibrato. Variation 5 has a very tricky start because it does not start on a downbeat, and it actually starts after a 16th rest. And so in order to place this correctly, again, it's so important that you do it with your metronome and that you have your subdivision on the 16th note. If you're doing that, then you're going to be able to place that note really easily. So the first thing that I would suggest to do is to pretend that this rest actually does have a note and play it as if it had a note. So what I would have my students do is just have them play another C right here, since there's a C right here. So I'm just going to have them play 2 C's and then you'll go up and just do that a few times. And what you're doing is you're practicing figuring out how long that rest is going to be. So let me play for you what I mean. That way, hopefully it'll make more sense. So all I did was on that rest, instead of resting, I put a C right there, another note, so that I could practice the length of that rest. Okay, so now all I'm going to do is I'm going to take that first note and just take it out. But I'm going to imagine that I'm still playing it. Okay, and then something else you can do if you're listening to your metronome. All metronomes will have a different tone for the downbeat. So you heard the first one was a different click and it was louder, and then the other 3 are the same click. So that first one is the downbeat, and this rest is representing that downbeat. So you're going to try to play this on the second 16th note. So you could also just practice playing this note by itself and just practice placing it. And then once you're really good at that, add on another note. So now I'm going to play C and D. Okay, and now I'm going to play 3 notes, C, D, E. And then I'm going to play all the way up to F. And that's all you have to do. And by the way, that took me about 2 minutes. And so if I do that exercise all the time, I'm going to be really good at coming in on the correct time right here with this C. And if you don't practice that, if you just kind of guess, then it's not going to be correct. So it's so important that you actually practice that. Okay, and then moving on, 31, 32, if you notice we have these same 16th note patterns that we were talking about a second ago. These are down, up, down, 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 up. So right here, you actually have to switch between those 2 rhythms that we talked about a second ago. So again, I would practice doing it first on 1 note. That way you're only worrying about the rhythm. And then try to go in and play it with all the different notes. So let's just play it right now on an F. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice going down, up, down, down, up. Down, up, down, down, up. Because that's what this does right here. And we're just going to do it on an F. And then once you become really good at that, then you can add the notes. If you notice, I'm still giving a little bit of length to the 8th notes. That's because this dot over the note is a staccato marking. A staccato does not mean that you should play it super, super short. It just means that it needs to be light and separated. So I'm still giving the 8th note a little more length than I am the 16th notes, just because you don't want it to be pecky sounding. You don't want it to sound like that. You still want to hear that they're 8th notes, and you want to get a really good sound without it being too short. And you want to make sure you're getting just your fullest, best tone. And then you have the same issue right here, this down, up, down, up, and you have different articulations. There's so much going on in variation 5, so you want to be sure you get all the details. Again, this right here is a tenuto marking, which means you're going to play it full value. So this note and this note should touch. And it's not going to be separated like the notes before it. So again, a really good way to do it is just to practice this a little bit by bit, and so you can be sure you get every little detail. Okay, so I'm going to start right here. This is measure 33, and I'll play 34. So 33 and 34. So this measure, short, short, long, long, long. You want to be sure you get all that articulation right there. Okay, and then at the very end, it is a little bit technical, but it's the same sort of thing that you saw in variation 4. You have a little bit of scale pattern. You're going down a note and then coming back up. I'm going to show you that great way to practice again, doing 1 beat at a time where you have a little bit of space in between. So this is how I think you should practice 35. And then do that a few more times until you can do it really well. And once you get to where you can play it like that 5 times in a row perfect, at least, then go ahead and play it as written with no break in between. So the most important thing about practicing technique is that you're not trying to bite off more than you can chew. So I'm sure you've heard that expression before. Maybe your parents have said that. You're practicing little chunks at a time. Even if you're saying, okay, I'm going to practice variation 5 today, that still doesn't even mean that you have to practice all of variation 5. Just practice little bits at a time. Because if you sit down and just try to play the whole variation all together, it's going to be very difficult for you to get good at it. So practice 1 measure at a time, 1 beat at a time, and then slowly build on it. You just have to continue to be patient with yourself. So the best musicians practice that way, and they're very patient. And that's how you're going to build on your technique. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and play all of variation 5 for you at the slower tempo, and then you'll hear it again in a minute at the faster tempo of 80. So right now we're still practicing at 50. And again, I'm going to be very careful with how I come in right here. Okay, so every time you have that tenuto marking, especially on a quarter note, you want to be sure you're using that vibrato with a really big, beautiful, full sound. Well, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this helped you out, and be sure you watch my other video, which is a full performance of the entire piece at tempo. I hope you guys are having a great time spending time at home with your family during this really weird time, and I hope you guys are being safe. And feel free to email me with any questions. I will leave you guys my email at the end of this video. So feel free to email me anytime, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions that you might have.